Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, June is Pride Month in Toronto and frankly in a lot of places around the world. And I was introduced to a guy that I think is going to be kind of interesting to chat with. Jad Jaber is his name. He is the founder and executive director of Marginalized Majority, and he's a board member of Pride Toronto, and he has been since January of 2020. And he's a member of LGBTQIA2S+, Toronto Advisory Council. He's written a book that we're going to chat about a little bit. He says that he wants to discuss the intersection and nuanced subjects that pertain to global South queer culture because, I think he's got an interesting experience. He says growing up in, it was Lebanon, correct? Where he said homosexuality was even more of a challenge to come out than it may have been in Toronto. So he's got the experiences of both growing up homosexual in Lebanon and also the experience of Toronto. And I'm looking forward to hearing what Jad has to say. Jad, how are you? Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm doing good. Looking forward to the end of this lockdown.
Yes, like a lot of us. So let's start out. Tell me a little bit about yourself. So did you grow up in Lebanon?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Beirut in Lebanon. I went to school there. At some point of my adulthood, we moved to Egypt and we also moved to Dubai and then ended up back in Lebanon. I did my master's in New York City and then did my doctorate in Switzerland and came back to Lebanon for my postdoctorate.
And what's your master's and your doctorate in?
My master's is in cross-cultural human resources management. So, for example, how to deal with a workforce in a place like Dubai versus a place like New York City. And my PhD is in Middle Eastern queer culture and gender dynamics that pertain to Middle Eastern women and North Africa.
Really? That sounds interesting. And tell me, when did you come out?
Amazing question. So, within Arab culture, we don't really talk about coming out so much. People kind of come in because we don't have that very, apparent come out to the world like TikTok gone viral video. Hey, mom and dad, I woke up gay, because unfortunately in our world, this would ended up getting hurt. We end up getting hurt. So I did not come out willingly. I came out because my mother is a strong and curious woman, and she kept on asking and asking and asking. Like everyone else, at first, I tried to say it was bisexuality, tried to make it as a phase, but eventually she knew and I knew as an adult that it wasn't a phase. So eventually I was forced to utter the word gay, which, by the way, in Arabic is a contentious word in itself. So only now recently we're creating words in Arabic to describe terms like gay and lesbian that is not derogatory, right? So only now we're even creating the language for our culture.
Why is gay a derogatory word in Arabic?
Well, because there isn't a word that directly equates to gay in Arabic. The word that equates to gay in Arabic is a derogatory word, which equates to a bad word in English, which we cannot say right now. Oh. There isn't an actual word that says gay or lesbian. Again, now in the past 5 years, this is being produced through the work of amazing queer Arab activists.
Now, is this a cultural or religious or both in regards to the sort of Lebanese or the Middle Eastern opposition to homosexuality?
Amazing question. So Lebanon is often described as a Switzerland of the Middle East. It's not really. That's a very false assumption. We are as Arab as any other nation. We were colonialized by the French, which adds a bit of Francophonic culture to us, but still the culture is predominantly very Arab. And what do we mean by very Arab? And this is there's a balance that needs to be maintained, right? Because folks tend to think that being Arab is being anti-queer. It's not really that way. There's a lot of queerness in the Arab world. There's a lot of intrinsic queerness in Arab culture. Even in the Gulf, the way men say hello to each other and flutter noses, or, most of the times, in many schools in Saudi or in the Gulf, in public schools, people of the same gender are helped together. So most people's experiences are with the same gender in And so a lot of this is to say that there's a lot of queerness intrinsic in our culture, a lot of queerness in our books. There are poets 1,000 years ago that wrote about queerness in Arab culture. The only difference is that the new sociopolitical framework kind of pushes away that queerness. I do believe that it's because of this westernized, queerness is seen as something that's westernized. And in the past 20 years or 15 years, Islam took a new direction. Islam took a direction that is more political, even though it is a religion of love and peace. But it was observed as being more political. Within that spectrum, you can see how queerness was seen as something that's belonging to the West, that's anti-religious, that's anti-Arab. But the truth is, that's not the case. Queerness, again, has existed in the Arab world for thousands of years.
Really? That's fascinating. Yeah. I guess maybe my prejudice is that homosexuality was frowned upon within the Arab world, the Muslim world, even more so than in the right-wing Christian world.
That's an amazing thing to say. So let me correct you on that.
Okay.
The laws in Lebanon that till now get a gay man like me jailed are French laws. The Arab world never created laws for anti-queerness. Similarly, in India, the laws that prohibited hujras, which existed as part of India for thousands of years, as if you want, as a gender fluid sect, up until the British came and said, what is this? We don't like this. Prohibit them. And then eventually the Indian population internalized that prohibition. Same thing happened in the Arab world. Almost 99% of our anti-queer laws in North Africa and Morocco and Tunisia and Egypt and the Arab world, all of it actually goes back to certain European colonialization, and even the name of the law still goes back to the same decreed number of French colonialism in Lebanon. So it's an interesting concept, what you just said. The truth is, again, there's intrinsically a lot of queerness within Arab culture. We are a collectivist culture, as they say. We have a shared meaning. So we build meaning through each other. We're not individualistic. We grow close. We grow up close to family members, close to friends, in close-knit homes. So there are a lot of things within Arab culture that make it very, very queer-friendly.
We're chatting tonight with Jad, is it Jaber?
Jaber, yes.
Jad Jaber, who is founder of the Marginalized Majority. We're going to take a break. We're going to take some messages and come back more with Jad. We're going to understand, Jad, we're going to understand a little bit more about his challenges growing up, his challenges coming out or coming in, whichever it is that you want to describe, and what he's trying to do in regards to making us all more accepting of homosexuality in our community. Given that it's Pride Month, it's something that we need to and should be talking about. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight because it's Pride Month with Jad Jaber, who's the founder of the Marginalized Majority, and he's a really kind of interesting guy. He's got a master's and a PhD in human relations in the masters of I guess diverse communities, and then in the PhD, it's got something to do with homosexuality in Middle East and North Africa. And it sounds kind of interesting. And then, Jab, you've written a book called Queer Arab Martyr, The Harem of Queer Secrets. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the book. Sure.
So the book actually is one of the biggest reasons why I ended up in Canada. So I always talk a lot about transmutation, right? What is transmutation? Transmutation is how we pass our emotions into things like poetry and art and anything that changes the nature of the energy of the emotion into, if you want, something productive. So I had faced a lot of pain and a lot of barriers growing up, and I transmuted all these things into my book. My book is based on 8 years of research in the Arab world, and it's very difficult to research queer things in the Arab world. The way it's done is through snowball sampling. So you have to know someone, and that person needs to know someone, and that person needs to know someone. And of course, they have to trust you, because if you ever disclose their name or disclose their identity, that means it's the end of, it's a very dangerous situation for them. So I gathered and collected data from Saudi, Kuwait, Egypt, Morocco, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and I started to collect all this data and collect all these, I call them emotional ethnographies, which are the stories of people.
Emotional what?
Emotional ethnographies.
Okay.
And, these are all stories that have never been told, right? Like, where have people heard about a 16-year-old non-binary, gender fluid Arab child? Or where have people heard about what it's like to discover yourself in an Arab village at the age of 13? Or where have people heard what it's like to engage in homosexuality in a place like Saudi Arabia, where the laws around this behavior are strict? So I was highlighting all these stories, and then I started to see themes. I collected all these themes and put out the book. The problem, Brian, is, when I gave the okay to the publishers for the book, I gave them the okay for the e-transcript, not the actual book. When the book came out, I was still in the middle of the Arab world, doing my postdoc in a very serious position, surrounded by family. And suddenly, and I had been teaching there since 2014, suddenly a conservative student messages me on Facebook and says, "Sir, did not know you are gay and writing about gayness." And I said, "What?" And he sends me a link on Amazon to my book. I go back to the email and I immediately send the publishers. I'm like, "I did not give you the approval to put my book on Amazon." But it was. So unfortunately, when that happened, a lot of my family members lost their job. I was threatened by people within my community. I was told to leave the country because the book goes against the laws of publications. And the book discusses a lot of things that pertain to religion and to culture so I had to kind of run away, so I left. The plan was to go to New York City on a one-way ticket to apply for political amnesty. And miraculously, after 3 years of waiting, my PR papers for Canada came through. But I had honestly given up. The PR papers came 48 hours before my one-way ticket to New York, before I knew I had to leave the country for good.
Oh my God. And this is Beirut. My impression of Beirut from the people I've met is that it's very progressive.
That's a very interesting thing. So there are a lot of drag performers, and we're very developed in our queer culture, but it's all hidden, right? It's all spaces that only through word of mouth you know about. And a lot of these spaces that are protected, that are queer, are protected politically and are protected through privilege, right? So if you're a poor Middle Eastern in the Arab world, without education, without knowledge, it's not going to be easy for you to create safety in your queer spaces. But if you're living in a $1.4 million apartment in your high rise in Beirut, of course, no one's going to address the queer spaces. And I found that something that's across all homophobic cultures, whether it's Caribbean, whether certain parts of Southeast Asia, whether the Middle East, privilege is always an exception.
And how have you found your acceptance in Toronto?
Well, that's another great question, Brian. So, there are some good things and there are some bad things. So working with Pride, for example, I did the flag raising with Mayor Tory. I saw there was real intention from Pride to highlight a queer Arab person. And that was very important. But that is what we call, kind of like an explicit show of love. Unfortunately, I would say that in Toronto, there's a lot of implicit racism and a lot of implicit, stances that are either Islamophobic, anti-Arab, anti-Black, and it takes only time for you to kind of be involved in these type of situations for you to bring out these micro-nuanced and implicit acts of racism. For example, on the second night I was here, I went to a gay pub. Second night I arrived in Toronto, and a woman basically walked up to me and noticed one of my friends having an accent. She asked where we're from. We said we're Arabs, and immediately she went on a rant against veiled women. And You know, Brian, it's so important to mention this right now because, as you know, a horrible, horrible incident happened yesterday in London, Ontario, and it's already been described as the CBC, and I have all the newsletters over here as as a hate crime, and 4 people were the victims of it just yesterday. And what's really mad is you have a lot of people saying, "What? Where's this coming from? What do you mean? Where's this coming from?" We know. You wanna know where this is coming from? Ask a veiled woman what her experience has been like. Ask a Somali veiled black woman. Ask a trans black woman. Ask. These are the people that have faced intersectional inequalities. These are people that have faced inequalities based on their immigration status, when they're described as not having valid experience because it's not Canadian. These are people that have had faced inequality based on the way their skin is, their beard, the color of the skin, on the way they walk, on their body stance, on the language, are not sounding professional enough, which is synonymous, unfortunately, you know, with non-racialized. Sounding professional is synonymous with non-racialized people. And you know, this is what's really shocking. And you know, when you ask me later on, this is how Marginalized Majority was founded. It was founded from me seeing a real vacuum, like me thinking, wow, this country has done so much, but it's also a baby. There's also so much for it to still do. It's also growing in terms of equity and inclusivity, and that's a beautiful thing. And we're all teachable. We all have a lot to learn. But coming here and seeing people like myself, seeing people commit suicide, Brian, people that I know last year, this was one of the main reasons why I founded this nonprofit. Is I was trying to get help. I'm like, well, where do I find my community? Where can I connect with people? If I'm having bad thoughts, if I'm anxious, if I'm depressive, who do I talk to? Where do I go?
So this is, sorry, I've lost you here. Is this mental health issues because of COVID, or mental health because of racism, or
Amazing question.
homophobia, or what?
Mixed altogether. COVID definitely exacerbated the problem. Originally, mental health is inaccessible. So you can, if you're not paying for mental health, for example, in Toronto, and you're accessing some of those agencies where you get mental health for free, most of the times you either have to go wait in line and see if you get your turn, or you'll be seen by one therapist, but not the same therapist next week. Or, you know what I'm saying? There isn't consistency in terms of mental health follow-up unless you're paying for it. We're talking about community centers. And COVID, as you mentioned, exacerbated this problem. And not to mention, there aren't many people working in mental health that understand these very culturally nuanced issues, such as the issue of coming out for an Arab, or, you know, anti-Black racism, or any of these other issues.
So tell me about this not-for-profit that you've founded called the Marginalized Majority. What is it all about?
Sure. So as I told you, being here, I started to do all these workshops in different organizations at the 519. I did almost...
What's the 519?
519 is a wonderful organization that's a nonprofit organization that's working mostly with supporting legally folks who are LGBTQ+. They also worked a lot right now with the homeless youth shelter. They support very marginalized people, the 519. So I did a workshop at the 519, a couple of workshops when I first moved to Toronto. And I did a workshop there. I did a workshop at Southeast Asian Alliance, ASAP. I did a workshop at Glad Day Library. And these are all LGBTQ plus organizations. From these workshops, like I told you, I noticed that there was a real need. There was a need for people to talk about their emotions, talk about things such as migrating homophobia, right? So just because families immigrate over here, it doesn't mean the homophobia does not immigrate with them. Talk about things like survivor's remorse, like many of us have survived coming here as queer people. But what about our queer brothers and sisters and non-binaries who did not survive back home? So we hold on to a remorse. Talk about the imposter syndrome, for example. Talk about feeling like an alien and feeling different and feeling not enough and always coming from that sense of weakness. These are all the subjects that we started to discuss in the workshops that I was doing. From these workshops, I saw the need, and from the need at the same time, a wonderful community member had passed away in Toronto. She's a queer Arab person. It happened at the same time. So I decided to register this nonprofit, incorporate it, and do another series of community consultations with all members of LGBTQ+. We did another 6 to learn from them, what do they want from a nonprofit? What do they want? From their recommendations, we built up a nonprofit that's flat, it has a circular structure, it's focused on emotions, it's focused on community. We don't have terms like leader or director, or everything has been, we've even, we even were taught by indigenous wisdom. We took everything that the community said and flattened this organization. And instead of creating an organization from before and saying, hey, let's bring in racialized people now. No, the organization was created to service racialized people. And so building it from the term marginalized majority, I was looking at, we're often called visible minorities. And I'm like, what? We're not visible minorities, we're invisible majorities. So I thought from invisible majorities, I would call it the marginalized majority. And that's where the name from.
And this organization does workshops and advocacy or what?
Absolutely. So we do advocacy, we do research, and we do workshops. We have serviced in the past 8 months, Brian, more than 3,500 active participants. 3,000. We have emails from people telling us, thank you, because of you, I did not commit suicide. Thank you, because of you, I found a community. Thank you, because of you, I was able to find a job. Thank you, because of you, I was able to tell myself who I am for my mother or explain my queerness to my mother. And I can give you a sample of the type of workshops that we've given.
Please do.
Were you going to ask me something?
What are some of the workshops?
Amazing. So we've given a workshop, for example, on the queer economy right now in sex work. So what's happening with queer immigrants that are unable to make their money, unable to have salaries? We gave a workshop on intersectional knowledge on anti-Asian racism. We gave a workshop on finding out hidden queer Arab stories from ancient Islam. We gave a workshop on surviving conversion therapy. We gave a workshop on people who hide their queerness, what happens in that schism. We gave a workshop on Middle Eastern drag performances. We gave a workshop on shame, on how we internalize shame, especially in unlearning. We gave a workshop on the politics of anti-fatness and anti-Blackness. We gave a workshop on anti-Black racism for newcomer refugees and asylum seekers. So we've given more than 45 workshops, including weekly drop-in spaces, Brian. So for anyone who feels lonely and they're Arab, we have a drop-in space that's less structured. For anyone who's trans and non-binary and a new queer immigrant, we have a drop-in space. And we're also a network. We have healers working with us. We have,
drop-in space is a virtual drop-in space or a real bricks and mortar drop-in space?
Everything is digital. Everything is digital, which is also difficult to do because in the past 8 months, 9 months as well, we've created strategies for digital safety, right? So safety is different for an Arab or for a North African Muslim coming on these Zooms. They don't want their name to be seen. They don't want their image to be seen. So we've also created strategies on how to inform people beforehand on how to enter these spaces anonymously and how to be safe. And we are honestly the first consistent digital platform that has led this many workshops and this many drop-ins and serviced this many number of people in such a short period of time.
Fascinating. It's excellent. And what's the website if people want to access your services?
It's called www.marginalizedmajority.org. And I also advise people to check us out on Instagram. We're called The Marginalized Majority, and on Facebook and on LinkedIn and on TikTok. And you know, we are a completely volunteer-led organization, yeah, we're changing the conversation because we are trying to pinpoint the intersectionalities within queer culture. We're trying to tell queer folks, hey, notice the difference within us, and notice that we sometimes inflict violence upon each other as queer. So this is also one of the missions that we're doing. We're weaponizing people with education, Brian. You know, I grew up in a world where I couldn't even describe myself to myself or to my mom. I couldn't describe it because I didn't have queer material. I didn't have books. I didn't have papers. And now we're putting out this material. More importantly, we're putting out material by global South people, by the have-nots of the world. And we're not being described by the haves, we're the have-nots describing our own experience.
Jad Jaber, founder of the Marginalized Majority. Fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break with some messages and come back more with Jad in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. It's Pride Month, and I was recommended to chat with Jad Jaber. He's the founder of the Marginalized Majority. He's got a really interesting backstory in that he's got a master's in human relations in regards to diverse employment groups, I guess, diverse organizations, and then he's got a PhD in what is it, homophobia in the Middle East and North Africa.
It's actually in queer theory and gender dynamics in the Middle East and North Africa.
Fascinating. And you know, it'd be interesting to come back to some of that. I have a lesbian friend from Ghana and a gay friend from Nigeria, both of which said they had to leave and come to Canada before they could ever admit to anyone who they were.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, yeah, you know, like I told you, this is one of the things that we talk about in Marginalized Majority and in my work. It's about not coming out because, you know, we can't go viral with our coming out. We come in, we bring people into our safety based on how safe they are. We might bring in a third friend, we might bring in a second cousin, we might bring in a sister, but there's no blanket rule behind it. We bring in people based on our critical thinking. So yeah, of course I understand, you know, there is a way to exist as queer in that part of the world, but not outward, you know, and of course, we all need to be acknowledged. We all need to be validated by others. And we all need that mirroring effect of our community.
Tell me a little bit about your own story. You grew up in Lebanon. Homosexuality, I understand, is a crime in Lebanon. How was it growing up? How did you come to terms with who you were and your identity?
It was very difficult. You know, I've always felt the feminine. I've always felt the feminine chakra or the feminine energy within me. I grew up with it. I expressed it in different ways, either by dressing in certain ways or playing with a Barbie but unfortunately in Arab culture, our parents don't really let you exist within the binary. They push you towards the binary. So it was traumatizing for me growing up to be pushed so violently into the binary. Don't dress this way, don't walk this way, don't behave this way. And I internalized all that trauma for a very long time. You know, I felt tolerated and not accepted. And I always advise all queer people to fine tune their emotions, to know within their families when they're being tolerated versus being accepted.
Yeah, Jad, yeah. You say trauma.
Yes.
How did this being forced to be in a binary kind of position become trauma?
Thank you. Amazing.
Were you beaten? Were you like what is trauma?
So trauma is a very wide term, right? It's a spectrum. So trauma, when you have trauma, you internalize fear, you internalize a narrative in your head. You start thinking something like, oh, I'm disgusting if I do this. I'm horrible if I do this. I'll never get love if I do this. And this is what conversion therapy, for example, does, right? It makes you associate these thoughts with queerness. When your parents come and tell you, hey, Barbies are not for boys, you in your mind, what your mind thinking is, I cannot be a feminine boy, right? So you take that feminine aspect of you, Brian, and you push it in a box. You push it in a box. The only difference is now we know, based on years and years of psychology and research, that there is nothing you can really push into a box. Everything eventually resurfaces. Who we are eventually resurfaces. As humans, we have a need to spiral out in our identity. We have a need to express ourselves further, to want validation, to be seen more. And, you know, I could not do that in the Arab world. And I had to come here. I had to come here and
So when did you come to the realization that you were gay?
I think I was around the age of 14 or 13. I was very, very young. I um, already, like I told you, because there are a lot of gender binaries in the Arab world, because, for example, in funerals, most of the time women are in funerals by themselves, men are by them. In celebrations, men in public schools. It was something that used to happen a lot in high school. And at first, I used to think it was only for me. But then growing up in the Arab world and doing my research, I discovered, wait for a second, this happens to a lot of Arab youth. A lot of them experiment and a lot of them have these feelings and a lot of them are valid for going through these things. So I started to experiment and feel these things at a very young age. My mom peeped through the window, through the door one time and saw me dressed in a certain way. And she was extremely angry. And, after that, I hid it. I hid it for as long as I can remember, up until I could not hide it anymore, up until I didn't have the option to hide it anymore. And, Brian, this is how people end up with double lives, because people hide so much that eventually they don't know how to merge. They end up with a schism. And that schism is dangerous. Someone like Bruce MacArthur, who killed a lot of global South immigrants in Toronto a couple of years ago, got away with murdering them just thinking that, wait, these people have a double life and probably their wives won't know and their children won't know, so I can get away with harming them more. So the double life thing harms us. It harms queer people, and we need to be aware of it. It's also called code switching. When you behave in a certain way and then code switching, yes.
What do you mean code switching?
Well, for example, if you're a straight Muslim man with your family, and then on the weekends you're dressing differently and you're going to a gay club and you're acting as your gay self, absolutely not related to that family household that you've represented, then you're switching codes, right? At some point, and this is what causes an internal schism in psychology. Right. And that internal schism is very dangerous for people. It makes them feel non-whole. And a lot of people facing that feel depression, feel anxiety, fall into consume drugs, etc. All these different things.
So I guess I'm a little bit surprised by this conversation, because I assumed acceptance of homosexuality was sort of something that we did a decade ago, and that you shouldn't feel so excluded, so prejudiced against in today's Canada. Am I wrong? Is this, I think that most people are far more accepting of LGBTQ plus than they were a decade or 2 decades ago, and it's almost a non-issue today.
I think
Am I wrong?
I think so. I think yes, because first of all, maybe some of us, we come from a certain level of, let's just say, imagine all these immigrant families, right, Brian? Imagine North African, Palestinian, Arab, Jewish, all these different diasporas that moved here across the past 300 years or 200 years and so. So, and this is a lot of what my research is about. Do you think that when cultures come here that they disseminate, they diffuse what their cultural thoughts are, or do you think they hold more into them? What do you think?
I think too often they hold on to their historical beliefs. There's too many of some of my friends that are recent immigrants and or not even recent immigrants, but immigrants for the last 20, 30 years that still spend too much time thinking about politics back in wherever they're from and sports back from wherever they're from than focusing on politics and sports and life and livelihood and community here.
So trace back that cultural imprint and imagine that ideas about gender and about homosexuality travel and stay and are as held onto as fervently, which means that when you look at a mixed Canadian, Arab, Canadian, person who is a third generation, and you're thinking, wait, this person went to schools here, speaks impeccable English, has a master's from UFT, but he still hasn't been able to come out to his family who's been here for 30 years. Well, guess what? Yes. And it's time, I think, that Canada acknowledges that these are the majority and that these are the people that advertisements, education, it needs to address the minority, those folks who the issue of homosexuality is passé, it's something of the past.
But if Canadian politics, Canadian laws, Canadian society is accepting of homosexuality, celebrates pride, doesn't restrict people legally in any way, shape, or form, no matter what their sexual orientation might be. You can't force people to change their cultural attitudes from wherever they've come from. Isn't it just time? Isn't it just a generational change? It's the old attitude of people, immigrants from Italy in the 1950s treated females in a way that would have been inappropriate, that would be deemed inappropriate today. But a generation later, those cultural challenges are gone. And I didn't mean to pick on one ethnicity. I think you could apply that to lots of different ethnicities. So with time, doesn't that solve a lot of issues?
I think that looking at what's happening now in politics and looking at the increase of cancel culture nowadays, whereby, hey, if I don't like what you're saying, I'll block you, right? And so we're all canceling each other at this point. The right wing and the left wing, everyone's into cancel culture. No one's really sitting in the discomfort of the conversation and sitting in the discomfort of learning. So from that perspective, I would tell you, no, I think that educating immigrant families needs to be strategic. And I think that the education more so needs to be accessible. I don't want my child to go to Ryerson or UFT and take a 6K course for him to know how to deal with LGBTQ+. These services, this awareness should be accessible. It should be for free. Marginalized majority, these educational programs that we've been given, these 3,500 people that we've educated, including a lot of Arab moms on how to accept their queer children, these are things that should have been thought about beforehand. These are not things that we should think, oh, well, let's see and wait what happens in 6 years. Well, what if in the next 10 years you get a radical politician that is making these stances more extreme or more, you never know. You never know how these things go. There needs to be an intentional idea of educating folks on these type of things in my perception.
Okay, but then we had these some politicians that almost said, you come to Canada, you got to be Canadian, you got to accept Canadian values and Canadian attitudes. Don't people have the right to keep some of their own? You talked already about veiled women. Don't people have the right to keep some of their cultural practices when they come to Canada? Do we have to make them all like Canadians?
That's very smart what you're saying, Brian. So I think that this conversation there's a fine balance, right? When we're talking about LGBTQ plus people, we're talking about human rights. We're talking about, basic rights. So I do think that, and we're also talking about a very culturally nuanced way of explaining things to people. So you can't, again, just like, you can't explain to my mom or to an Arab veiled mom or tell her, hey, let's put you on some RuPaul's Drag Race and get you educated on the LGBTQ plus culture. Like, you can't do that. You need to be strategic. You need to think, well, what does my mom think? What is her cultural background of the issue? What is her religious framework say about the issue? How can I access her from an empathetic and intelligent way? Then you can tailor a program, and then you can make positive changes. And these changes need to be done for all these intersectional issues, Brian. Again, we're seeing a horrible hate crime happen yesterday. So that hate crime is because these issues have not been resolved. It means that these spaces where people can talk about Islamophobia or anti-Semitism are not being placed, but people need to talk about them. People need to express their emotions towards these type of things. And when they're not,
Okay, so what, but hold on for a second. So let me just challenge you for a second. What you're saying is that when you come to Canada, you're allowed to keep your culture, but not if it is homophobic or racist. But what if it is sexist, anti-female? And some Canadians, I'm not saying this is the reality. I'd like to hear your response. Some people in Canada clearly think that a veil is a way of male superiority or subjugation of females or hiding females from society, etc. And so you're saying that veils are okay and we should accept it, yes. But homosexual being anti-homosexual or prejudiced is not okay.
Yeah. So the veil is a very specific issue. The veil is something that was, of course, as we know, worn by, Jewish religious figures, by nuns, by now at some point, I always laugh a lot because there was such a big issue about the niqab. And then when COVID happened, everyone was in a niqab, right? Like everyone was covered. I'm like, you had moms with like 3 layers. And I'm like, so what? Now it's fine just because. So the issue of the veil is very contentious because I grew up in the Muslim Arab world. And believe it or not, Brian, in all the courses that I gave, one of the questions that I always gave in teaching university was asking Arab women why they chose to wear the veil. Many times the reply I expected was, it wasn't my choice, but actually most of the times it was their choice. So the veil is autonomous. The veil actually gives a Muslim woman power. It doesn't take it away from her. It gives her power within the household. It gives her power on the street. It gives her agency. It gives her autonomy. And the only reason why
How does it give her autonomy and agency? I don't understand.
So autonomy means power of movement and agency means power of decision making. So
how does the veil give that?
Let me give you a small example. A lot of Arab women feel more comfortable in maneuvering as feeling modest in their body. They are more comfortable feeling that way. They feel more protected from other people looking or other people dealing with them in a certain way, or maybe other people sexualizing them or other people, feminizing them, or they feel protected in their bodies when they're veiled. They feel protected in public. They feel protected walking amongst men. So that is just one thing off the top of my mind that I can tell you about that. And again, let's see of it from all other religious perspectives, right? Like a veil is something that has been worn by all different religions. And it's very important for us to know that Muslim women, many of them want to be veiled. They want to be veiled. It's very important to say that point. Because the perception is that they're forced, but that's not the truth.
So bottom line, I think what you're saying is acceptance.
Yes, 100%. It is acceptance. It's tolerance. It's empathy. And it's also keeping your eye on intersectional inequalities and intersectional privileges. So if I'm looking at you, for example, Brian, and I want to say, how do I deal with Brian as a person doing with equity? The way I deal with you coming from an equity perspective is I look at your intersectional inequalities and your intersectional privileges. So what inequalities layer on top? For me, for example, is it something related to my physical being, my religion, my background? What are the inequalities? What are my privileges? Is it my education? Is it my white passing as an Arab? Is it? Once you get a formula of these, then you can make a proper idea of how to behave with a person equitably. And that's important in corporate spaces. Very important, because you have to give voice to people who face more inequalities. In HR and recruitment, you have to acknowledge intersectional barriers that, for example, a privileged white passing Canadian would not face that another person would face. So you have to acknowledge these things in corporate culture and in day-to-day culture.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments. We're chatting tonight with Jad Jaber, who is the founder of Marginalized Majority. It's Pride Month. It's been a fascinating conversation. Stay with us for some concluding comments in just a minute. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Second and 60. We're chatting tonight with Jad Jaber, who is the founder of Marginalized Majority. He's a fascinating gentleman. He's got a master's in human resource management and diversity. He's got a PhD in homophobia in Africa and the Middle East. And he's written a book that I wish we could have got into in more detail, but it sounds like it's got some fascinating stories. And the queer, what is it again? Tell us the book.
It's called Queer Arab Martyr, and it's available on Amazon. If you're an Arab mom who wants to understand her kids better, if you're a kid who wants to understand yourself better, if you're an adult, if you're a teenager, please get this book, Queer Arab Martyr. It's also illustrated with beautiful art and emotion and direct quotes from Arabs from all around the world.
Jad, if you wanted to say something to your younger self, what would you say?
Thank you, Brian. So, I thought I would leave this wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for having me here, with a little word of advice that I always give queer folks and myself all around me. So I'm going to say it. We often become the internal narrative that we weave ourselves into. So what is the voice you address yourself with in your weakest and most vulnerable of moments? Is it a kind, forgiving voice, or is it a critical, ruthless voice? Do you give yourself the credit for your power and survival today, or does that voice constantly remind you of what is lost versus what is present? I want you to be aware of that voice in your head. Do you paint yourself as the victim, the unlucky one, the learner, the survivor? Are you your own worst critic? The narrative and thoughts you have before you sleep will often become the reality of your morning. So make sure you empower yourself in the story you tell yourself about yourself. You are the hero and the lead of your own story. Finally, for many of us who are queer, from Southeast Asian culture, Caribbean and Arab collectivist cultures, we have forged our queer identities with love and time and will and intention. So give yourself credit for who you are today. Let your queer adult self today hug your queer, younger, more innocent, childlike self of yesterday. And please, folks, support Marginalized Majority, as we are a complete nonprofit organization. Thank you, Brian.
Remind us what the website is, Jad.
It's www.marginalizedmajority.org. We're also on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
So, Jad, I really appreciate you joining us tonight and telling us about you and your life and your history and your story and your research and your organization. As many people probably know that listen to my show, my best friend, my brother, my son, numerous other people in my family are gay, and all of them have suffered. And I'm shocked when they tell me the stories about the trauma that they've suffered, because I think that we're very accepting in our society. But all of them have suffered some issues, some trauma, some problems. And so I think that we need to hear people like Jad, and we need to understand the difficulty of being a marginalized majority, and we need to be more accepting. And so I think Pride Month, I've been proud to both march in Pride parades and to watch Pride parades in the past, and hope I get to do it again in the future. And I remember I had a picture that I posted on Facebook of me holding up a sign that said, "I'm proud of my gay son." And he started crying to me. And I said, I'm proud of you. Why is it? But for you to say this publicly means a lot to me, Dad. And so I think it does mean a lot to people for us to acknowledge them publicly. And so, Jad, I'm glad you moved to Canada. I'm glad that you've created the organization that you've created, and good luck in the future, sir.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great to meet you, and hope to see you soon.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.
Good night.